It was the summer of 2019, and I was pulling another graveyard shift at the McDonald's on Route 41, just outside of Louisville, Kentucky. Working nights wasn't so bad once you got used to the rhythm of it. Quiet stretches punctuated by the occasional trucker looking for a quick meal or a group of teenagers stopping by after a late-night hangout. But that night was different. There was something off from the very beginning, though I couldn't put my finger on it at the time. The shift started like any other. The usual crew was there: Jenny, the overcaffeinated manager who never seemed to leave the place; Mike, the cook who always grumbled about the night shift pay; and me, stuck on register duty. By midnight, the rush had died down, and we settled into our routine. The kitchen was quiet, the fryer oil sizzled softly, and the only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint music from the speakers overhead. Around 1:30 a.m., the front door chimed, signaling a new customer. I glanced up from the register to see two boys standing just inside the entrance. They couldn't have been older than 12 or 13. Something about them immediately set me on edge. Maybe it was the way they were dressed: old, oversized clothes that looked like they had been picked out of a thrift store bargain bin. Or maybe it was their pale, almost sickly complexion, made even more eerie by the harsh lights of the restaurant. "Welcome to McDonald's. What can I get for you tonight?" I asked, forcing a smile. The two boys didn't respond right away. They just stood there, staring at me with these unervingly dark eyes. Not just dark, black, like their pupils swallowed up any light that tried to reach them. "Do you have a restroom?" one of them finally asked, his voice a whisper that barely carried across the counter. The question was odd. The restroom was clearly visible from where they stood, the sign illuminated by a flickering bulb. "Yeah, just over there," I replied, pointing in the direction. The boy who had spoken nodded, but neither of them moved. They just continued to stare at me with those empty, hollow eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine, an instinctual sense of danger that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "Is everything okay, boys?" Jenny called out from the back. She must have noticed the strange tension, too. The boys turned their heads slowly towards her voice, then back to me. "We're just waiting," the other boy said, his tone flat, devoid of any emotion. I didn't know what to say to that. Waiting? For what? There was no one else in the restaurant, and they hadn't even placed an order. I tried to shake off the unease settling in my gut. Okay. Let me know if you need anything," I managed, though my voice sounded weaker than I intended. The boys said nothing, and, after what felt like an eternity, they glided over to the corner booth, the one farthest from the counter. They sat there, side by side, and stared out the window into the night. It was almost like they were watching something out there, though the parking lot was empty. Time seemed to slow down after that. I kept glancing over at them, expecting them to move, to order something, to leave, but they just sat there. Jenny and Mike didn't say much, though I caught Jenny giving them uneasy looks now and then. The tension in the air was palpable, thick and heavy like a storm about to break. As the minutes dragged on, I found myself checking the clock more and more, silently praying for the shift to end. But just when I thought I might be able to ignore them, one of the boys looked directly at me again. His gaze was so intense that I froze in place. Then he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the most unnerving thing I had ever seen, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "We're waiting for someone," he said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. Before I could respond, the lights in the restaurant flickered. Once, twice, then plunged us into complete darkness. My heart jumped into my throat as I fumbled to pull out my phone, its weak glow the only source of light. I could hear Jenny swearing in the back, and Mike's heavy footsteps as he made his way to the fuse box. And then, just as suddenly, the lights came back on. I blinked against the harsh brightness, my eyes struggling to adjust. When I finally looked back at the booth, the boys were gone. The seats were empty, and there was no sign of them anywhere in the restaurant. A cold sense of dread settled over me as I realized that they hadn't walked past me to leave, and I hadn't heard the door chime. It was like they had simply vanished. I felt my pulse racing, the rational part of my brain trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation that made sense. Jenny emerged from the back, looking flustered. "What the hell was that?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't tell her about the boys. I didn't know how to explain it, and something told me that talking about it would only make it more real, more terrifying. But the feeling of being watched never left me that night. Even after we locked up and I drove home in the early hours of the morning, I couldn't shake the sensation that those black eyes were still on me, watching, waiting. And deep down, I knew that whatever those boys were waiting for, it wasn't something I wanted to find out. The next few days at work were a blur, but that night, those boys stayed with me. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that maybe I had been tired, maybe the dim lighting had made their eyes seem darker than they really were. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, the memory clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I didn't tell anyone, not even Jenny or Mike. Something about it felt too strange, too unreal to put into words. Besides, the more I kept quiet, the more I could convince myself that it had just been a weird encounter with a couple of kids trying to spook a tired cashier. But then, 2 nights later, they came back. It was just after midnight, and the shift had been slow. The occasional car rolled through the drive-thru, but the inside of the restaurant was empty. Jenny was in the back office, probably catching up on paperwork, and Mike was busy with the grill, humming along to whatever old rock station he had tuned into on his portable radio. I was standing at the counter, staring blankly at the register, when the front door chimed again. My stomach dropped as I looked up. It was them, the same 2 boys, dressed in those same oversized clothes, looking exactly as they had before, down to the eerily black eyes that seemed to drink in the light around them. This time I was sure of it. There was something unnatural about them, something that didn't belong in the bright, sanitized world of fast food and fluorescent lights. My heart pounded in my chest as they approached the counter, their footsteps making no sound against the tiled floor. I didn't even bother to greet them this time. I just stood there, frozen, as they stopped in front of me. The taller of the 2 boys, the one who had spoken before, leaned in slightly. "We're still waiting," he said in that same soft, hollow voice. His words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to say something, do something, anything to make them go away. "Look, you can't just hang around here all night. You need to order something or leave," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. I tried to sound authoritative, but it came out weak and unconvincing. The boy just smiled that same unsettling smile. "We will. Soon." Before I could respond, they turned in unison and walked over to the same booth they had occupied before. Once again, they sat there, side by side, staring out the window as if they were waiting for someone, or something, to appear out of the darkness. I could feel my breath coming in shallow gasps as I watched them. I wanted to go into the back, to tell Jenny and Mike, but something held me in place. It was as if I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from those 2 figures. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The boys didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. It was as if they were statues, perfectly still and eerily quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the kitchen and the distant crackle of Mike's radio. Finally, I forced myself to look away, to focus on anything else. I started wiping down the counter, my hands trembling so badly that I almost knocked over the napkin dispenser. I was just trying to keep busy, to distract myself from the growing dread gnawing at my insides. And then the lights flickered again. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as the restaurant was plunged into darkness for the second time that week. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of Mike cursing as he fumbled around in the dark. I reached for my phone, but my fingers felt numb, clumsy. The screen cast a dim glow in the pitch-black room, barely enough to see by. I could feel the panic rising in my throat as I turned the light toward the booth. Empty. The boys were gone just like before, but this time something was different. The booth wasn't just empty, it was cold. I could see my breath misting in the air, and when I reached out to touch the seat, it was like touching ice. I pulled my hand back quickly, my pulse racing. My mind was screaming at me to get out, to run, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. I didn't understand what was happening, but every instinct I had was telling me that I was in danger. The lights flickered back on, brighter than before, and I jumped, nearly dropping my phone. I blinked against the sudden brightness, my heart still pounding in my chest. "Hey, what the hell's going on out here?" Jenny's voice broke the silence as she came rushing out of the back, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. Mike was right behind her, looking equally rattled. I don't know," I stammered, my voice barely audible. The lights just went out again, and those boys, they were here but now they're gone. Jenny frowned, glancing around the empty restaurant. "What boys?" "The ones from the other night," I insisted, but the words sounded crazy even to me. How could I explain that these kids had just disappeared, leaving behind a booth that felt like it had been sitting in a freezer? Jenny looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Are you sure you're not just seeing things? It's late. Maybe you need to take a break." "No, I'm not seeing things," I snapped, though the fear in my voice was impossible to hide. "They were here, Jenny. I'm telling you, something's not right." Mike shook his head, clearly annoyed. "Kids trying to mess with us, that's all it is. Probably sneaking in and out just to freak us out. Let's just finish the shift and go home. This place is giving me the creeps." Jenny sighed, clearly not convinced but too tired to argue. "Fine, let's just get through the night." I didn't argue, couldn't. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced, but nothing added up. I kept glancing over at the booth, half expecting the boys to reappear out of thin air. But the rest of the shift passed without incident, and by the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. When I finally got home, I collapsed onto my bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those boys staring at me with their hollow black eyes, their cold smiles haunting me. And in the silence of my darkened room, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they were waiting for, it was far from over. After that second encounter, I dreaded going back to work. Every time I stepped into the McDonald's, a chill ran through me, a constant reminder of those boys with the black eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting. My anxiety gnawed at me, and I started jumping at every little sound, every flicker of light. Jenny noticed. She cornered me one night, a few days after the last incident, her face lined with concern. "You sure you're okay, kid? You've been jumpier than a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Maybe you should take a few nights off. Get some rest." I wanted to take her up on the offer, but something held me back. It was a deep, gnawing curiosity that I couldn't ignore, a need to understand what was happening, even if the truth terrified me. "I'll be fine," I said, forcing a smile that I knew didn't reach my eyes. "Just need to get through this week." She didn't push, just gave me a sympathetic nod and went back to her paperwork. But the truth was, I wasn't fine. I was far from it. It was a Thursday night when everything came to a head. The shift started normally enough, with the usual trickle of customers and the familiar sounds of the kitchen. I tried to keep my mind occupied, focusing on my tasks and avoiding the booth where the boys had sat. But as the night dragged on, a sense of dread settled over me, heavier than before. By the time midnight rolled around, the restaurant was empty. Jenny had gone home early, leaving me and Mike to close up. The silence felt oppressive, the air thick with anticipation. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. I was wiping down the counter, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease, when the front door chimed. My heart lurched into my throat as I looked up, expecting to see those same boys. But the restaurant was empty. The door hung open slightly, swinging gently on its hinges as if someone had just walked through. I stared at it, my mind racing. I hadn't seen anyone approach, hadn't heard any footsteps. But the door was open, and the faint scent of something acrid, something foul, wafted in on the night air. It smelled like burnt plastic mixed with something else. Something rotten. "Mike!" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. The kitchen was silent, too silent. The usual clatter of pots and pans, the hiss of the fryer, had stopped. I took a hesitant step toward the door, peering out into the darkness. The parking lot was empty, the night still and quiet. But the smell lingered, stronger now, almost overpowering. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to gag. I stepped back inside, pulling the door shut, but as I did, I felt it. A presence, cold and heavy, standing right behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The boys were there, standing in the middle of the restaurant, their black eyes locked onto mine. But something was different this time. Their pale skin looked almost translucent under the harsh lights, and their smiles had twisted into something sinister, something hungry. "We've been waiting," the taller boy whispered, his voice sending a chill down my spine. Couldn't move, couldn't speak. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear as they slowly advanced toward me. "Who are you?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice barely more than a rasp. "What do you want?" The boys stopped, their smiles widening. "We want to play," the shorter one said, his voice almost childlike. But there was a malice behind it that made my skin crawl. "It's your turn now." "My turn," I echoed, confusion and terror battling for control in my mind. Before I could say anything more, the lights flickered, casting the room into strobe-like flashes of brightness and darkness. Each time the lights went out, the boys seemed to move closer, their movements jerky, unnatural. I could hear a low buzzing sound, like static, growing louder with each flicker. When the lights finally steadied, they were right in front of me. The taller boy reached out, his cold fingers brushing against my arm. I jerked away, stumbling back into the counter, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "You can't run," the boy said, his voice almost a purr. "It's already too late." A surge of panic flooded through me. I bolted for the kitchen, desperate to find Mike, to get out. But as I burst through the swinging doors, I skidded to a halt. The kitchen was empty. Mike was gone. And in his place, the room was filled with that same sickening smell of rot and burning. "Mike!" I called out, my voice trembling. But there was no answer, only the oppressive silence and that foul stench. I started to back up, the cold fear settling in my bones, when I heard it. A faint, wet slapping sound, like something dragging across the floor. My breath hitched as I turned toward the sound. The freezer door was slightly ajar, and the noise was coming from inside. My first instinct was to run, to get as far away as possible, but something compelled me to move forward, a morbid curiosity driving me closer. I reached out with a trembling hand and pushed the freezer door open wider. The cold air rushed out, but it wasn't just cold. It was freezing, a bone-chilling cold that made my breath puff out in clouds. And then I saw it, lying in the middle of the freezer floor. Or at least what was left of him. His body was twisted at unnatural angles. His limbs contorted as if something had broken him apart and put him back together wrong. His eyes were wide open, frozen in a look of sheer terror, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. But what made my blood run cold was the way his skin seemed to be slowly turning black, like frostbite spreading across his flesh. The same darkness that filled the boy's eyes was consuming him, creeping over his skin, and I knew, somehow I knew, it was eating him from the inside out. I stumbled back, gagging, and spun around to run, but the boys were there, blocking my path. Their faces were twisted into grotesque parodies of what they had once been, their smiles now gaping maws filled with needle-like teeth. They moved in unison, advancing on me, their bodies flickering like a broken video feed. "No!" I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive air, thick and heavy like a blanket smothering me. The taller boy reached out again, and this time I couldn't pull away. His icy fingers wrapped around my wrist, and the cold shot through me like a shockwave, freezing me in place. I could feel it spreading, that same blackness that had consumed Mike, seeping into my skin, crawling through my veins. "It's time to play," the boy whispered, his voice echoing in my mind, louder and louder until it was all I could hear. The darkness closed in, and my vision started to blur. The last thing I saw before everything went black was their faces, those hollow black eyes boring into mine, their twisted smiles promising a fate far worse than death. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the restaurant, the lights glaring down at me. I was alone, the boys gone, and the smell had vanished along with them. But the cold remained, seeping into my bones, a constant reminder of what had happened. I staggered to my feet, my body trembling, and stumbled out into the parking lot. The sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, but the world felt wrong, distorted, as if I was seeing it through a veil. I never went back to that McDonald's. I quit the next day without explanation and left town soon after. But no matter where I go, I can't escape the feeling that they're still watching me, waiting for the day when they'll come back to finish what they started. And every night, as I lie awake in bed, I can feel that cold creeping over me, hear their voices whispering in the dark, reminding me that no matter how far I run, I'll never truly escape. Because once you play their game, you belong to them forever. Second story, the dark side of KFC. I never thought a job at KFC would lead me down such a dark path. My name is Tom, and I've been the manager at a small-town KFC for over 5 years. The job was simple enough: manage the team, keep the customers happy, and ensure the chicken was always cooked to perfection. It was a routine that became second nature to me, until one day everything changed. It started with a memo from corporate, something about a new secret blend of herbs and spices that was supposed to be the next big thing. They sent us a batch of the new seasoning, with strict instructions to start using it immediately. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, new products and promotions were a regular part of the fast food business. But this was different. The first batch of chicken we cooked with the new seasoning smelled different. Richer, more intense. The aroma filled the kitchen, making our mouths water. Even the regular customers seemed to notice. They'd take a bite, then another, devouring the chicken faster than usual. At first, I thought it was just a sign that the new recipe was a hit. Sales went up, and the customers kept coming back, day after day, always asking for more. But then, things started to get weird. One of my employees, Jenny, was the first to notice. She came to me after her shift one night, her eyes wide with fear. "Tom, something's not right," she whispered. "Have you seen how people are acting? It's like they can't get enough of this stuff. They're eating more and more even when they're full. And it's not just the customers. I can't stop thinking about it either. I ate some after work last night, and now I can't get the taste out of my mind." I brushed it off at first, thinking she was just being paranoid. But as the days went by, I couldn't ignore what was happening. Customers were coming in 3-4 times a day, ordering more food than ever before. Some of them even started acting aggressively if we ran out of the chicken. Fights broke out in the dining area, something that had never happened before. Then there were the employees. Jenny wasn't the only one who was hooked on the new recipe. I noticed that the staff was eating more of it during their breaks, even sneaking pieces when they thought I wasn't looking. They became jittery, irritable, and some of them even started showing up late or calling in sick. I decided to investigate. After closing one night, I took a bag of the new seasoning home with me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about it felt off. The label didn't list any ingredients, just the usual secret blend of herbs and spices tagline. I knew I had to dig deeper. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the seasoning, about the way it made me feel when I tasted it. There was a strange craving building inside me, one that I couldn't shake. But I forced myself to resist, to not give in. The next day, I called corporate, trying to get more information about the new recipe. But every time I asked questions, I was met with vague answers or outright silence. It was clear they didn't want me to know what was really going on. That's when I realized I was on my own. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just about the chicken. There was something much more sinister at play, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. As I sat in my office that night, staring at the bag of seasoning on my desk, a cold chill ran down my spine. I knew that uncovering the truth might come at a price, but I had to find out what was in that seasoning and what it was doing to us. And so I made a decision. Tomorrow, I'd take a closer look at the ingredients, no matter what it took. Because if I didn't, I feared that soon it wouldn't just be the customers and employees who were addicted, it would be me too. The next morning, I arrived at the restaurant before dawn, determined to find out what was hidden in that seasoning. I had spent the night tossing and turning, haunted by nightmares of customers with ravenous eyes and employees whose faces twisted in unnatural ways as they devoured the chicken. It felt more real than just bad dreams. More like a premonition of what was to come if I didn't act. The restaurant was eerily quiet when I entered. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerators and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. I went straight to the storage room where we kept the bags of seasoning. The one I had taken home still sat in my office, but there were plenty more here. I grabbed a bag and brought it to the prep table. The packaging was plain, almost generic, with no indication of what was inside beyond the usual branding. I carefully cut it open, and the smell hit me immediately. Pungent, overwhelming, almost intoxicating. It was the same scent that had been driving customers and employees wild. But now, in the stillness of the empty kitchen, it felt menacing. I poured some of the powder onto a plate and stared at it. It looked like any other seasoning. Tiny granules of different shades of brown and red, flecked with what might have been herbs. But something about it made my skin crawl. I needed to know what was in it, beyond the simple ingredients listed on the label. I had a friend, Mark, who worked in a small lab just outside of town. He owed me a favor, so I gave him a call and asked if he could run some tests on the seasoning. I told him it was urgent, and though he sounded skeptical, he agreed to help. While waiting for the results, the situation at the restaurant only grew worse. The number of customers continued to increase, and with them came more chaos. People were coming in at all hours, some of them looking disheveled and desperate. They'd sit at tables, devouring plate after plate of chicken, their eyes glazed over as if they were in some kind of trance. And the staff. God, the staff. Jenny hadn't shown up for her shift in 2 days. When I called her, she sounded distant, almost robotic, mumbling something about needing more chicken. A few others had started calling in sick as well, or just not showing up at all. Those who did show up were barely functioning, their eyes bloodshot, their hands trembling as they worked. I tried to confront them, to ask if they were all right, but they just nod or shrug, too distracted to engage in a real conversation. Mark called me back later that evening, his voice tense. "Tom, I don't know where you got this stuff, but it's bad news," he said. "There's something in here that shouldn't be. I'm still running tests, but whatever it is, it's not natural. It's a compound I've never seen before, and it's definitely not something that should be in food." I felt a pit form in my stomach. "What do you mean, not natural? What does it do?" "I'm not sure yet," Mark replied. "But from what I can tell, it's some kind of psychoactive substance. Powerful one. It's designed to trigger addictive responses in the brain. Stronger than anything I've ever seen. Whoever put this in the seasoning knew exactly what they were doing." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a corporate experiment gone wrong. This was deliberate. Someone had laced the seasoning with a drug that was driving people insane with addiction. And the worst part? We were the ones serving it to them. "Tom, you need to get rid of this stuff. Now," Mark said urgently. "If word gets out about this, I don't even want to think about the consequences." But it was too late. The addiction had already taken hold, and people were hooked. I thanked Mark and hung up, my mind racing. I couldn't just throw the seasoning away, not with so many people dependent on it. But I also couldn't keep serving it, knowing what it was doing to them. I decided to confront corporate, even if it meant risking my job. I had to know why they'd send us something so dangerous, and more importantly, I needed to find a way to stop it before it destroyed everyone. But as I reached for the phone to make the call, a thought struck me, one that I hadn't considered before. What if corporate knew exactly what they were doing? What if this was part of some twisted plan to keep customers coming back, no matter the cost? My hand hovered over the phone, paralyzed by fear. I realized that I was no longer dealing with just a bad batch of seasoning. I was up against something much larger, much darker, and I had no idea how far it would go to protect its secrets. The next morning, I found myself standing in the empty restaurant, staring at the bags of seasoning lined up on the shelf. The decision weighed heavily on me. Do I throw it all away and risk the wrath of corporate? Or do I keep serving it, knowing that with each piece of chicken, I'm feeding a monster I can't control? Before I could make a move, the front door swung open and Jenny walked in. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale. She didn't say a word as she made her way to the kitchen, her movements robotic. I watched in horror as she grabbed a piece of chicken from the tray, the new seasoning glistening on its surface, and began to eat it with a ferocity that sent chills down my spine. I knew then that whatever I was dealing with, it was too late to stop it. The addiction had taken hold, and it wasn't going to let go. But I had to try. I had to do something before it consumed us all. Little did I know, the true horror was only just beginning. I couldn't shake the image of Jenny devouring that chicken, her eyes empty, her soul seemingly hollowed out by whatever sinister force had taken hold. It was as if she had become something else entirely, driven by an insatiable hunger that no amount of food could satisfy. I knew I had to act, but I felt powerless, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. The decision to confront corporate had been hanging over me like a storm cloud, but as the days passed, I realized that I needed more than just answers. I needed proof. I spent my nights digging through records, searching for anything that could link the new seasoning to the horrors unfolding in my restaurant. But everything was clean, too clean, as if someone had deliberately erased any trace of wrongdoing. Desperation gnawed at me as I watched my employees spiral further into addiction. Customers became more aggressive, their eyes wild with the need for their next fix. Fights broke out regularly, and it wasn't long before the local news caught wind of the chaos. Reporters started sniffing around, asking questions I couldn't answer. I was running out of time. Then, one night, I received an anonymous tip, a single email sent to my personal account. The message was brief and to the point. Meet me at the old warehouse on 8th Street. Midnight. Come alone. Attached to the email was a file, labeled Simply Truth. I hesitated before opening it, knowing that whatever was inside would change everything. The file contained a series of documents, lab reports, internal memos, and emails between high-level executives. My heart pounded as I read through them, the truth slowly unfolding before me. The new seasoning wasn't just a product of innovation. It was a calculated experiment, a way to test the limits of human addiction. The substance they had introduced was an engineered compound designed to target the brain's reward system, making the food irresistible and highly addictive. And it wasn't just my restaurant. It was a nationwide experiment, rolled out in select locations under the guise of a new recipe. The final memo sent a chill down my spine. It detailed the expected results: increased sales, repeat customers, and, eventually, total dependency. But it also mentioned something else, something that hadn't been mentioned in any other document: the possibility of side effects. The memo was vague, but it hinted at something much darker than mere addiction. It spoke of behavioral changes, neurological disturbances, and, most disturbingly, unforeseen consequences. I knew then that I had no choice. I had to go to the warehouse, had to confront whoever had sent me this information. I couldn't do it alone, but I also couldn't involve anyone else without putting them in danger. So, at midnight, I found myself standing outside the dilapidated building, the cold night air biting at my skin as I pushed open the rusted door. The warehouse was dark, save for a single light at the far end, casting long shadows across the floor. I stepped inside, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. As I approached the light, I saw a figure standing in the shadows, waiting for me. "You made it," the figure said, stepping into the light. It was a man, older than I expected, his face lined with age and worry. He wore a suit that looked out of place in the grimy surroundings, and his eyes were sharp, calculating. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small vial, filled with a dark, viscous liquid. He held it up, letting the light catch it. "This is what they've been putting in the seasoning," he said. "It's a compound designed to enhance flavor, but its real purpose is far more sinister. It's a drug, one that's been engineered to create dependency." "But that's just the beginning." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. He sighed, lowering the vial. "The substance also has side effects, severe ones. It alters brain chemistry, rewiring the neural pathways responsible for impulse control, aggression, and fear. Over time, it turns people into something else, something inhuman." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the full weight of his words sank in. "Why are you telling me this? Who are you?" "I was one of the scientists who helped develop it," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "But I didn't know how far they would go. When I realized what they were planning, it was too late. I tried to stop it, to warn people, but they silenced me, erased my identity. I've been in hiding ever since, trying to find a way to undo the damage. Then why not go to the authorities? I asked, my mind reeling. Because they're in on it, he said, his voice cold. The company has powerful connections, enough to bury any evidence and silence anyone who tries to expose them. But if we can get this vial to the right people, to someone who can analyze it and prove what they're doing, we might have a chance to stop it. He handed me the vial, and I took it, feeling the weight of the small glass container in my hand. It was as if I was holding the fate of everyone affected by this nightmare. Be careful, the man warned. They'll do anything to protect their secret. Trust no one. With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone in the warehouse. I stood there for a moment, clutching the vial, my mind racing. I knew what I had to do, but I also knew that I was now a target. The company wouldn't stop until they had silenced me too. As I left the warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and every sound made me jump. I hurried back to my car, clutching the vial like a lifeline. But as I drove away, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was no longer in control. The company, the addiction, the horror, it was all bigger than me, and I was just a small piece in a much larger, much darker game. I had the proof I needed, but I also knew that getting it to the right people would be the hardest part. The road ahead was dangerous, and the enemies I faced were powerful. But I had no choice. I had to fight, had to expose the truth, before it consumed everyone I cared about. And as I drove through the empty streets, the lights of the city flickering in the distance, I realized that the real horror wasn't just what had been done. It was what was still to come. The battle had only just begun. Third-story supernatural encounters in fast food chains. Working the night shift at a fast food chain was never my favorite choice, but I needed the money, and the tips helped pay the bills. I was used to the steady flow of tired customers, truck drivers looking for coffee, and young people hungry after a night out. Nothing out of the ordinary until that night. The clock had just passed 2 a.m., and the rush had died down. I was wiping tables and tidying up the counter, hoping time would pass quickly so I could go home. That's when he walked in. The automatic door made the familiar ding as he approached the counter. At first glance, he seemed like just another lonely customer, but there was something strange about him that I couldn't quite place. He wore a worn-out hat that hid part of his face, and his clothes were covered in a thin layer of dirt, as if he had walked miles through the desert. But it was his eyes that really caught my attention. They seemed empty, lifeless, like two opaque spheres barely reflecting the restaurant's light. "Good evening. Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound as polite as possible. He didn't respond immediately. He stood there, staring at the menu above my head. The prolonged silence began to make me uncomfortable, and I almost repeated my question. But then he spoke, in a hoarse and drawn-out voice. "Coffee? Black." I found it odd, since most people who order coffee at that hour are in a hurry, but he didn't seem to be in any rush. I quickly prepared the coffee and handed it to him. When I extended the cup, a chill ran down my spine as I noticed his hands were cold as ice, despite the hot coffee he was holding. "Anything else?" I asked, hoping he would just take the coffee and leave. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to a table in the darkest corner of the restaurant and sat down, without touching the coffee. I went back to my tasks, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. Something about him deeply unsettled me. His presence seemed to make the room colder, heavier. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to flicker more than usual. The clock ticked on, and he remained seated there, motionless. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that exhaustion was playing tricks on me. However, when I looked again at the table where he sat, my heart nearly stopped. He was no longer there. The chair where he had been sitting was empty, and the coffee I had served was untouched, still hot, with a thin wisp of steam rising from it. I looked around, expecting to see him somewhere else in the restaurant, but he had simply vanished. No door had opened, and I was completely alone. A wave of panic began to form in my stomach. I wanted to run, to leave everything behind, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. Then I noticed something even more disturbing. Where he had been sitting, the floor was wet, as if he had brought the rain with him. But outside, the sky was clear, with no sign of any storm. I started to doubt my sanity, wondering if I had really seen that man. I decided that enough was enough for one night, and I went to the manager, who was in the back, seemingly unaware of everything that had happened. When I told him what I had seen, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, a mix of skepticism and something darker. "You're not the first to see something like that," he said calmly. "These things happen from time to time around here. It's better not to think too much about it." He went back to the office, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and with the inexplicable cold that still lingered in the air. I tried to continue my work, but my hands were trembling, and my heart was racing. All I wanted was to finish the shift and get out of there as quickly as possible. As morning approached, the restaurant began to fill up again with the usual customers, but I could barely focus. The manager's words echoed in my mind. These things happen from time to time. What the hell did he mean by that? And why did I feel that whatever the answer was, I didn't want to find out? I could barely sleep after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, or at least what I could see under the shadow of the hat. The empty eyes, the way he vanished, kept replaying in my mind. Things felt strange at work, too. My coworkers noticed my distant behavior, but no one dared to ask. It was as if, deep down, everyone knew something was wrong. A few days passed, and I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I was just tired, exhausted from the sleepless nights. Maybe the manager was messing with me. But something in his expression told me he knew more than he was willing to admit, and that only made my curiosity grow. During a break, I finally decided to approach one of the older coworkers, Mike, who had been working there forever. He was the kind of guy who had stories for everything, and if anyone knew something, it would be him. I waited until we were alone, with the restaurant almost empty, and asked him directly, "Mike, what did the manager mean when he said, 'These things happen from time to time'? Have you ever seen anything strange around here?" He looked at me for a second, as if deciding whether or not to tell me. Then he sighed and took a sip of the Coke that was always by his side. "Look, you're not the first one to have a weird encounter here. The truth is, this place has a reputation among the night shift workers. Almost everyone has seen or heard something strange. Some talk about customers who appear and disappear out of nowhere. Others mention voices coming from the kitchen when no one's there. But what you saw sounds like the coffee guy." "Who is the coffee guy?" I asked, my heart racing. "He shows up every now and then, always the same way you described. He walks in, asks for a black coffee, sits in the back, and never touches the coffee. I've heard about 5 people talk about him, always under the same circumstances. No one knows what he wants, and as far as I know, no one's ever had the guts to confront him." Mike paused, and I could see he wasn't just telling a story to scare me. There was a seriousness in his eyes that made my stomach knot. "Once," he continued, "one of the old managers tried to talk to him after realizing the man just disappeared. But when he approached him, the coffee guy looked him straight in the eyes and whispered something. No one knows what was said, but after that, the manager quit the same week. Never showed up again." I didn't know what to say. Mike's words echoed in my mind, and a chill ran down my spine. So, that's it? I asked, trying to stay calm. We just wait for him to leave? And pretend nothing happened? Basically, he replied. Or you can do like some people and quit before he shows up again. I laughed, trying to lighten the mood, but the truth was Mike wasn't joking. He had gotten straight to the point. There were no easy answers, just a growing sense that something very wrong was happening in that place. In the following days, I started paying more attention to what the others were saying. Rumors circulated among the staff, but never out loud. It was almost as if talking about it might attract whatever it was. And the story of the coffee guy wasn't the only one. There were reports of a woman in a white dress who appeared at the drive-through window in the middle of the night. But when someone went to serve her, no one was there. Others talked about hearing footsteps in the kitchen, even when the place was empty. Each of these stories made me feel more uneasy. What was going on there? Why hadn't anyone done anything about it? However, my curiosity began to be replaced by a growing fear. And that's how, one night when my shift had barely started, I saw him again. The door made the same ding when he walked in. The same worn-out hat, the same dirty clothes, and of course the same empty eyes. My heart stopped for a second, and everything inside me screamed to run. But something kept me frozen in place. Maybe it was the desire to understand, or maybe fear had paralyzed me. Either way, I was stuck there, watching as he walked up to the counter. This time, he didn't even glance at the menu. He just lifted his eyes directly to mine and spoke with that low, hoarse voice. Coffee, black. My hands trembled as I prepared the order. When I extended the cup, he held it for a moment, and the same icy sensation returned. But this time, he didn't go to the table in the corner. He stood there, motionless, staring straight at me. Something was different. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the empty eyes of the man standing in front of me. He held the cup of coffee as if it were a piece of crystal, but he made no move to drink it. The silence between us stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and the air around us grew heavy, suffocating. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. Do you know who I am? He asked, his voice slow and hoarse like before, but now there was something more to it, something threatening. I swallowed hard. My mouth was dry, and I could barely form words. I don't know. Who are you? He tilted his head slightly, as if pondering my answer, and then, with a slow movement, placed the coffee back on the counter. The dark liquid swirled inside the cup, but not a drop spilled. Many have tried to find out, but none survived what comes next. Those words chilled my blood. He was speaking in riddles, but the fear growing inside me was very real. I didn't know what to do. Run? Scream? Something told me that any reaction could be fatal. And then everything around me began to change. The restaurant lights flickered, and for a moment, the entire place went dark. When the lights came back on, the place was no longer the same. The tile floor was cracked and dirty. The walls were covered in dark stains, and the smell of mold was suffocating. It was as if the restaurant had aged decades in seconds. I looked around, dazed, but the man was still there, staring at me with those dead eyes. "Welcome to my world," he whispered. Fear overwhelmed me, and before I could react, he began to change. His skin started to wrinkle and shrivel, as if aging rapidly. His clothes disintegrated into dust, and the hat fell to the floor, revealing a bald, scarred head. What was left was no longer human. It was a skeletal figure, with hollow eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was trapped in that nightmare, unable to move, unable to fight. He took a step toward me, then another, as the floor around us crumbled into darkness. Everything I knew was disappearing, being swallowed by that malevolent presence. "You never should have asked," he said, his voice now a deep, guttural growl. "Now you're mine." His words echoed in my mind as the world around me collapsed. The ground beneath my feet gave way, and I felt like I was falling into an infinite abyss, with the creature's face the last thing I saw before being consumed by complete darkness. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on the restaurant floor. The lights were normal, and the place looked exactly as it had before. I was drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The coffee was still there on the counter, untouched, but the man, or whatever he was, had vanished. I struggled to stand, my legs shaking. What had just happened? I didn't know if it had been a dream, a vision, or if it was all real. But one thing was certain, I couldn't work there anymore. I grabbed my things and went to the manager, determined to leave that place for good. Before I could speak, he looked at me with a serious expression and nodded, as if he knew exactly what I had been through. "I warned you," was all he said. I walked out of the restaurant without looking back, but as I headed to my car, I knew something in me had changed forever. No matter where I go, that experience will stay with me, haunting me, like a shadow that never disappears. And every time I see a fast food place by the roadside, a chill runs down my spine, because I know that somewhere that thing is still waiting, ready to appear when you least expect it.